Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. We're going to get our presentation started. So, Hynes Scholars cohort of 2017 and 2018 is really excited to present our research project for this year, which is Who is a Benny, Who is a Johnny? An analysis of campus inclusivity. And so we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. We're just going to go down the row. I'm Alejandra Gallardo.
I'm Elise Miller.
I'm Alexis Neese.
Julia Petron.
Sia May.
Bridget Mark.
Martha Koenig.
Mary McConville.
Louise Halpert.
Kai Salmo.
Ellie Ritters.
I'm Alexis Solheide.
And I'm Tessa Venables.
The Hynes Scholars cohort is a group of sophomore women dedicated to exploring gender and leadership throughout our campus and our world. We engage in personal exploration, reflection, scholarship, and dialogue concerning the topics of gender and leadership, but also social justice, self-actualization, and self-awareness. And we leave Hynes with a clear vision on how we can continually positively impact the world around us.
The year-long cohort has 2 different goals each semester. First semester, we meet bi-weekly and listen to different speakers, discuss different topics, such as inclusivity or women in work, and then we have a discussion afterwards. We also are put into book groups and read a book relating to gender. Second semester, we are primarily focused on developing this research project that we're showing to you today, and we meet bi-weekly to assess our progress. We also aid in recruiting and interviewing next year's cohort.
The research question that we decided to discuss was what conceptualizations of the Benny and Johnny identity are held by CSB and SJU students. We thought this was especially important because of all the recent discussions that have been going on our campus about inclusivity, and we wanted to learn who did and who didn't feel included in these identities, why they did or did not, and what we could do to change that.
So as Louise has mentioned, we thought this topic was important to research because of students' feelings of not being included in the Benny and Johnny identity. And to inform our research, we thought it was important to understand the importance of college identity on campuses worldwide. And our research has showed that feeling like one belongs or identifies with their college identity is associated with positive outcomes, and feelings of being excluded from that identity is associated with negative outcomes. And David Cheng is one researcher who found positive outcomes from feeling like one belongs. And he found that students who felt cared about and valued within their community often have higher quality social lives than those who feel excluded. In addition, Karen Osterman found that belongingness impacts individuals' motivation and behavior, and reports that students who experience acceptance are often more highly motivated and engaged in learning, as well as more committed to school. And while feelings of belonging have had positive impacts associated with them, feelings of exclusion or the lack of belonging have negative sort of correlations. And the CSB SJU report, Inclusive Pedagogies, What Must Faculty Do to Teach Inclusively, found that feeling excluded from the college identity is associated with feelings of isolation and identity negotiation. And they also found that feeling like one doesn't belong is related to fighting stereotypes, as well as a lack of cultural competence within their community.
All this research is kind of general overarching of feelings of belongingness, and we didn't find any specific research studies done within colleges because we felt that it was our college situation and our institution setup is so unique that we didn't really want to compare it to other colleges because they don't have the same kind of setup as we do, having 2 separate gendered universities and colleges. So that's why it was more general research. And so with that, we like to read our mission that states, the College of CSB and SJU confirm our mission to teach and foster respect for diversity, to embrace the marginalized, and break down privileges that would exclude those who are different or disadvantaged. And with this being our mission, we thought it was very interesting because of these ideas that people have been having of the lack of inclusivity, especially when this is our mission of the college. And with this, there have been more kind of people coming out and saying these ideas in more recent record articles within the record at our school. And the top one, someone stated, this is a record article from last year, that there's a hostile and isolating environment at CSB and SJU for the marginalized students. And this was important to mention because of the fact our mission statement includes accepting everybody and not putting down the marginalized. And then another comment from this recent year said, the obvious cannot be dismissed. There's a significant cultural and racial disparity within our beloved St. John's University and College of St. Benedict. So we felt that these were important to point out. We're not connected with our mission statement of the two colleges, and this is what we kind of wanted to look into more.
And so throughout this research, we did want to acknowledge that these conversations about diversity, about inclusion, have been happening for a long time. And we've seen a recent push in recent years to continue these conversations. And so we found an article, a blog post from a student in 2012 that was written for a literary theory and criticism course entitled, Why Bennies Aren't Feminists, How Gendered Fantasies Create Us. And this student talks about the terms Benny and Johnny and how they kind of create our identities here, or how they fit into our identities, writing, at St. Ben's and St. John's, you are locked into an identity complex, Benny or Johnny. And you may spend your 4 consecutive years shifting uncomfortably in this ambiguous but very real set of gendered expectations. The student further goes on to say that when we come to St. Ben's and St. John's, from the minute we come on campus for our first tour and hear the terms Benny and Johnny and hear people talking about them, we are taught what it means to be a Benny, what it means to be a Johnny. And this student writes, we learn what we are to look for in each other, and more importantly, what in turn we are supposed to embody. And so this shows that for a lot of students, these terms, Benny and Johnny, really affect the way that we look at ourselves and the way that we view others on our campus. And while we were creating this research design as well, we were kind of wondering whether or not, since we are a group of all women, we wanted to just focus on the term Benny or include Benny and Johnny as well. And I think this student puts it really well when she writes, talking about Benny means talking about Johnny. At their roots, these two identities were mutually constituted in a gendered way. And so this shows that these two terms are very linked to each other. They rely on each other. The way they're defined depends on the definition of the other. And it shows that there is a very gendered context in which these identities play out on our campuses. And so moving into more recent articles that we found, we looked a lot at student opinions in the record because we feel like students often turn to that platform to express the way that they're feeling about inclusion on our campuses. And one record article in particular really stuck out to us, and it was written by a couple of graduating seniors last year entitled, The CSB SJU Experience is Not the Same for All Students. And this is one St. Ben's student who wrote, I am a Benny, but I did not have the typical CSB experience. I never felt completely accepted nor comfortable. To me, this is not the picture-perfect community that everyone likes to brag about. We pick the voices we want to be heard and silence those who object and ask for change. And this student further goes on to write about her experiences at St. Ben's and St. John's, specifically highlighting her orientation experience in her first couple of years, where she writes that because of these different parts of her identity, such as being a part of the Latinx community, growing up in a single-parent home, rather than a double-parent home like her roommates did, coming from an urban setting in a lower socioeconomic class, she felt like she didn't really fit in with the other students who referred to themselves as Bennies on our campus. And one quote that stuck out to us in particular, or one story that she shared, was part of her orientation week. So this is the first time that she had really experienced being a part of this community. She was eating dinner with her orientation group, and they were all talking, and one of the young men sitting across from her started singing the song America from West Side Story. And she asked him why he was singing that, and he told her, because in the movie they speak in broken English, and you are too. And so we just found that that was a very troubling experience, and we hope that that's not something that happens every day or that happens often on our campuses, but it just shows that from the very start of students' experiences here, there are instances such as that cause people to immediately feel excluded from the terms Benny and Johnny and from the community that those terms create on our campuses.
So we've been hearing these stories and wanted to know if there was any prior data that we could compare our own research to. So one of the things we looked at was the 2016-2017 senior survey, which is a survey given out to the graduating class every year by the school. Two of the questions in the survey that we thought related to our research were, I found a community at CSB-SJU where I feel like I belong, and students here actively engage with those outside of their own race or ethnicity. And both of these, the majority of people agreed or strongly agreed, but we have to also note that there's a large amount of disagree or neutral too. A few of the other questions we looked at were students here actively engage with others outside of their own economic background, their own sexual orientation, and their own religious beliefs. And these two are also agree as the majority of responses, and same with strongly agree, but one thing we need to keep in mind is there's still a very large amount of neutral or disagree responses. And even though neutral is neutral, that means they can't decide whether they agree or they can't decide whether they disagree too. So one thing we got out of this was for our own research, we have to keep in mind that belonging isn't just if the majority feels included. With the senior survey regarding community and inclusivity, 90% of seniors selected community as a word that characterizes CSB-SJU, but only 57% selected inclusive, showing that even though most people say our school is a community, for many people we're not an inclusive community. Another piece of research we decided to look at to compare to our own was the Mellon Grant Survey, which was a survey given out to all students and faculty administered by Jean Keller and Kyle Lindgard. Regarding identity and privilege on this survey, 21% of respondents said another person assumed that they were admitted due to their identity, and 90% of students of color agreed to some degree that they have to work harder than others to be accepted by other students at the CSB-SJU campus. And then regarding derogatory remarks and profiling, 20% of respondents said they were targets of derogatory remarks, and 19% said they were targets of racial profiling. So based on the recent record articles, events on campus, and these survey responses, we know that many students do not feel included on our campus, which led us to believe that many students also don't feel included under the Benny and Johnny terms. Although the majority of seniors in the senior survey responded that they agreed that they felt like they belonged, many students disagreed or had a neutral response. As Benedictine institutions rooted in the value of community, we need to respond and take action to make sure everyone's included, not just the majority.
Okay, so far we've given you or tried to give you an understanding of our inspiration for doing this project. And then second, we tried to give you the context within our school of other surveys that had been done in the past. So after reviewing all of these other surveys, we've kind of seen an opening for our own development of a survey. And with this survey, we hoped to kind of assess the understanding of identity on campus within the frame of the Benny and Johnny labels, and then also to use this momentum of the project to create real change. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the development of our survey. So we spent a lot of time discussing how to make sure our survey was representing our research question. It was an anonymous survey that we sent through email to both students and alumni of both institutions. We also did some tabling in Gretzky Fireside asking people to take our survey. So some of our demographic questions included, are you a CSB student, SJU student, or alumni? What is your graduation year? Do you identify as a person of color? How would you describe your race/ethnicity? How would you describe your gender? How would you describe your sexual orientation? How would you describe your family's socioeconomic status? And so these questions were purposely left open-ended so that we could collect data which was most representative of the respondent.
Other questions that we asked on our survey revolved around more identity type questions, and so we asked people to list the top 3 words and the top 3 social identities that they thought applied to a Benny and a Johnny. And we wanted to find the stereotypes that people typically associate with Benny and Johnny identities and see if they show potential exclusive trends in those identities. We also asked if the respondent felt included, and if they said no, we optionally asked them how they could improve this. And we wanted to see ideas of how the campus may become more inclusive for those that were feeling excluded.
So now we are going to tell you guys about the results of our survey. So we had a total of 222 respondents. Out of those 222 respondents, 66.2% of the respondents were CSB students. 20.2% of the respondents were SJU students, and 13.5% of the respondents were alums.
And so amongst those 222 respondents, about 74.8% were identify themselves as white or Caucasian. And then we do have a variety of other respondents who would identify with a different race or ethnicity. And then we do like to point out that 19.8% of our respondents did identify as members of person of color.
All right. Another part of our survey, we asked respondents to identify their sexual orientation. 80% of respondents identified as heterosexual or straight, 5.2% identified as bisexual, and we also had small percentages of people identifying as pansexual. We had a small percentage of people saying that they would prefer not to say what their sexual orientation is, and we also had another small percentage of people who were unsure. And 12% of these respondents identified as something other than what we have listed on the slide.
And then now on this slide, we're going to talk about the gender identities. So 72.5% of the participants identify as female, 23.8% of the participants identify as male, and 3.6% of the other participants identify as other.
And then when we inquired after their socioeconomic identities, 60.4% did identify as middle class, and then we had 7.2% as upper class, 27.5% as lower working class, and then 5% chose not to respond, so the majority did fall in that middle class.
Moving on to the next part of our survey, we asked respondents to list the top 3 words that they would use to describe Bennies or Johnnies, as well as the top 3 social identities that they would use to describe Bennies or Johnnies.
So this is a word cloud. So how does a word cloud work? It's all the words on there are the words that all the respondents reply to. And then the bigger the words, that's the most response that we received. So then the top 3 words so we asked the question, we asked participants to list the top 3 words they would use to describe an average Benny. So 14.8 responded smart as one of their top 3 words. 13.1 responded strong as one of their top 3. And then 10.8% responded kind as one of their top 3 words. And then 7.2% responded as intelligent as one of their top 3 words. And 6.8 responded with friendly as one of the top 3 words.
Next, we asked people to describe the top 3 words that you would use for the average Johnny. The most common word that we found was 14.8% of respondents describing Johnnies as smart, 10.8% describing Johnnies as friendly, 10.4% describing them as nice, 9.46% describing them as kind, and 9% describing them as athletic.
So this next portion of our survey involves social identities. We define social identities as a person's sense of who they are based on group memberships. So this word cloud, we asked respondents to please list the top 3 social identities they associated with the typical Benny. So as you can see, 30.2% of respondents listed white as their top social identity, 10.8% listed Catholic, 9.5% listed student, and 6.8% listed both female and women. And 2 other results that we included was partier and privileged. So from these identities, you can see that gender, race, academics, and religion appear to be the identities that most people associate with Bennies. However, some of these social identities may fit some Bennies while excluding others, so it's important to keep this in mind. And then we included these 2 other words just because there are so many words in the word cloud that you aren't able to see all of them. And we thought these results were interesting and we wanted to include them. Overall, there were 293 unique social identities associated with Bennies.
And then we asked them to please list the top 3 social identities you would use to describe the average Johnny. And so you can see that out of the 5 top results, 3 of them are similar to Benny's. So that being white with 27.5%, Catholic with 9.8%, and student with 8.1%. And then the other results we had were athletes with 8.5% and partiers with 7.2%. And in a very close 6th, we had male being at 6.7%, and then we included leader with 4.5%. So the 3 similars, again, tie back to just religion, race, and academics, as well as the male, including that gender. So we just like to point that out, that those are kind of the definings of Benny and Johnny, but also the different genders are what make us different. And then we included athletes because amongst the culture, there is a strong supporting of our athletics, which is a great thing, but there are also a lot of students that wouldn't identify themselves as athletes or don't particularly enjoy those kind of activities, so that can feel, wake everyone up, but that can be exclusive just if you don't particularly enjoy those kind of activities. And then we did include partiers because it kind of goes along the same thing as athletes. Not many people may identify themselves as partiers, so that can feel exclusive if that's kind of your case. And then we did include leaders because that's something that our institutions do take pride in, is trying to give us the skills and the kind of just the knowledge to become better leaders in our future lives.
All right, next we're going to talk a little bit about comparisons and contrasts between Bennies and Johnnies. So for Bennies, a lot of respondents listed strong. 14% of people answered strong as a word to describe Bennies. 7% would describe Bennies as bold. 6% said that they would describe them as confident, and 5% would describe them as hardworking. Johnnies, 9% of people said that they would describe Johnnies as athletic. 7% would describe them as nice. 5% would describe them as loud, and 5% would also describe them as outgoing. But we also had some overlap between the two as well. 23% of respondents would describe Bennies as white. 22% of respondents would describe Johnnies as white. 19% would describe Bennies as smart. 13% would describe Johnnies as smart. 15% would describe Bennies as kind. 9% would describe Johnnies as kind. 10% would describe Bennies as kind, and 9% would describe Johnnies as kind as well.
This next bar graph is kind of getting at the main purpose of our survey. So we wanted to see whether or not students felt included in the definition of a typical Benny and Johnny. And so 25% strongly agreed that they felt included in the definition of a typical Benny or Johnny. 39.8% agreed, 19% felt neutral, 10% disagreed, and 6.2% strongly disagreed. So as you can see, more people strongly agree or agree that they feel included in this definition. However, as we've mentioned, it's very important to consider that there is still a large amount of students who do not feel included in this definition. And so we need to take this into account just as how our institutions define Bennies and Johnnies, and then as how we ourselves define Benny and Johnny's. As we've said, community is a school pillar, and if students don't feel included in the school identity, then we can't really create this sense of community among students. We also wanted to see if there was any difference between alumni, St. Ben students, and St. John students and their feelings of inclusivity. So alumni were the largest percentage who strongly agreed that they felt included in the definition of a typical Benny and Johnny. Bennies were the largest percentage who agreed. St. John students and alumni were tied for neutral, and then St. John students were the largest categories for disagree and strongly disagree. However, there are limitations with our survey that we will discuss, so it's important to take these results with a grain of salt, but we might want to consider that perhaps Johnnies do feel less included in this definition.
So we looked at the reasons why people did feel included in the definition, and the top 2 reasons that people listed as feeling included were being white and being middle class. And this is really important to recognize because although a lot of students are a part of these 2 identities, these do tie into a lot of the stereotypes that many people listed previously, and they can be exclusive. And people also listed pride of academics, campus involvement, and attending school here as reasons that they did fit in. And this is also important because these can apply to all students, and there's a much wider range of inclusion in this one.
So we also went ahead and identified a couple of reasons why some people do not feel included in the Benny and Johnny identities. As Kai explained earlier, feelings of exclusion from a college identity can result in feelings of isolation and disengagement from the college experience. So one of the reasons we drew from the responses is geography. One respondent said, "I'm not from Minnesota, don't really like football or sports, and I feel like an outsider with most people on campus." Another respondent said, "Being from Colorado, I am not like the majority of students that from the Midwest area such as Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa." The regional culture is very tight-knit and rooted in generations of history. Students can feel excluded because many of the local values are carried out on campus and leave some feeling outcasted for not participating in or understanding the practices and values of the local dominant culture. Stearns County and the larger Minnesota community have traditions, language, arts, government, and economic systems that are familiar to its citizens. So when you have students coming from different locations and cultures into a place that highly reflects the regional culture, it is understandable that there can be a division of groups that identify more closely with each other. Another factor that came up was religion. As a Catholic Benedictine institution, CSB-SJU caters to this category of students. Those who do not practice religion can choose not to take part in such activities, but for the students that practice alternative religions and rituals, accommodations and access are scarce. One respondent said, "While I fit many of the characteristics of a Benny, like white and female and heterosexual, I am not religious, and I feel very uncomfortable with this. I also feel like I don't share similar life goals with Bennies. A typical Benny is looking for an MRS degree, just looking for a Johnny to get married to." Another respondent said, "For the most part, I feel that I am included within the parameters of this definition. However, I am not Christian. I feel that this is something that separates me from a majority of the community here, as many people are Christian and I am not. I feel that I have sometimes been excluded from certain groups or perceived negatively by them because of this." Religion is often a source of conflict between cultures, and it is important within a community since it answers basic questions about the meaning of life and supports values that people feel are important. Exclusion on the basis of religion lets us know that we have a lot of fundamental improvements that can be made to reduce exclusion. Socioeconomic status, race, and politics were another 3 reasons for exclusion that were mentioned throughout the survey. One respondent said that their lower socioeconomic class than the average Benny interfered with their identity under a label. Another respondent said, in reference to race, Benny and Johnny are usually referring to white people. And since race is a part of someone's identity that can't be changed, feeling excluded from a community on this basis is stressful to say the least and often results in less diverse grouping on campus. Another respondent said, "Sometimes feel that I am an outsider in regards to some ideas since I come from a more conservative home state." And Socioeconomic status and politics are some factors that are typically a part of a person's identity based on their family history, so it's hard to control.
In conclusion, most respondents did feel included within the definitions of a typical Benny and Johnny. The top social identity listed for both of these groups was white, and the top word was smart, which indicates that academics is very important to St. Ben's and St. John's students, and I think that's something we can all take pride in. But we need to consider that some of these words and identities created both a sense of inclusion for some students and exclusion for others. So geography, religion, socioeconomic status, race, politics were all identities and words that were inclusive for some and exclusive for others. So I think it's important that we realize there are students who do not feel included within these definitions. Both the administration and students need to work harder to make these definitions more inclusive, because this will make a better college experience for everyone.
We like to mention too, with every study and research comes limitations to those studies. One that we thought stood out was that a majority of the student respondents to our survey, they were white. So just with everything we've talking about with different identities, that is not representative of everybody on our campus. So we felt that was a big limitation. Another one was that a majority of the student respondents were from St. Ben's. So that shows a lack of St. John's students in this survey, as well as alumni as well. Another one was there was a small sample size, so about 6% of the student population responded to this survey. So I think there's around 3,100 students on our campus today and only 222 respondents we had. But I would like to mention too that even though this study isn't generalizable to the whole college on campus, it's really important to recognize that every answer is important, and we need to consider everybody that did respond and not just say it's not important because it's not generalizable, because it is important, because everybody has a voice and they used it by taking this survey. And then the last one was that we only had 33 respondents answer the optional question of what we could do to be more inclusive as a university and college.
So now that we've done all this research, we want to use it to motivate change within our communities. But this will require that we do more than just listen. It means that we have to listen with intent of change. The 16.2% of students who don't feel a part of our community require that we stand up for them. Mary Dana Hinton said in her speech at the All-Campus Community Forum, "What this means is that at this moment in time, we have to focus on ensuring that every student at the College of St. Benedict's feels as if this is her home." We have a responsibility as members of this community to ensure that all of our peers feel comfortable, especially identifying with the terms Benny and Johnny. So in this last part of our presentation, we're going to explore ways that we can act on Mary Dana Hinton's words and work tirelessly to include all.
And so before we jump into talking about ways that we can foster greater inclusion on our campuses, we want to recognize the work that our institutions are already doing, because we are doing a lot to try to increase inclusion on our campuses. So along with the Mellon Grant and Inclusivity Vision surveys and processes, we have a variety of programs on campus, such as Advocates for Inclusive Mentoring, the College Navigator Fellow, First Year Experience, Intercultural and International Student Services, the Center for Ethical Leadership and Action, Intercultural Lead, College Possible, Student Accessibility Services, as well as a variety of student clubs which seek to both educate our campus about different identities that students hold and to provide events for students of all identities on our campuses. Within our pedagogy, we have been trying to work to provide more professor trainings, which focus on microaggressions and more inclusive pedagogy and teaching. And within that, we have been trying to introduce a wider variety of authors and scholars into our institutions who are more representative of multiple identities that students will hold. We also host a variety of reflection action dialogue events, which help to shed light on microaggressions and identity through the form of theater and interaction. We have a variety of campus surveys, ongoing curriculum reform, staff training and development days, like the Inclusion Visioning Day, which was inclusive of the entire campus, the Mellon Grant Survey, like was mentioned before. And then within our alumni relations, they're working to build stronger networks of students of alumni of different identities, such as alumni of color and LGBTQ plus alum networks. And then we have had some policy changes, such as our policies regarding transgender students, which state that students will be admitted to the colleges based on the identity that they hold regularly in their life, rather than or regardless of the sexual and gender orientation they were assigned at birth. And we have also worked to diversify our faculty and have rebranded a number of different things, such as rebranding the father-daughter dance and the mother-daughter brunch to Benny Ball and Benny Brunch to make those things more inclusive for students on our campuses.
So many of the examples we just gave you were things that were initiated by the institution, and one thing that we wanted to do was challenge CSB and SJU students to make this effort as well. And this is why in our survey we included a question that asked for suggestions on what we can do to inclusivity on our campus. And with making these suggestions more clear, we split them into more general suggestions and more specific suggestions. And generally, these suggestions related to increasing conversation on campus with the intent to listen. And participants in this survey suggested that we engage actively in conversation that includes multiple groups on campus, as well as working towards fostering more campus-wide discussions. And suggestions also included that these discussions should work towards creating an understanding of others' views that may not be the same as our own. And not only should these conversations be about race and ethnicity, these conversations should be about a wider variety of topics, and suggestions included about privilege, masculinity, and sexuality. And one thing that we found really profound within our survey was a comment by a student who said, offering acknowledgement and respect for others and showing them that you see them as human. And this was in reference to discussions and the point of discussions, because seeing each other as human beings is sort of the most important foundation of what we can do to learn and increase inclusivity moving forward.
Okay, so 3 more themes we extracted from our survey suggestion section. We're diversifying the faculty. One student said, as a minority here, it is crucial seeing and meeting professors who share similar backgrounds to me. Another was increasing events and activities which include people of color, and having events and activities that appreciate all other cultures. Another particularly interesting one is that they suggested requiring the FEEs to include 3 cultural events on campus. And then another one was to play music from different cultures on the bus and in Gretzky. The last theme we extracted was education, so possibly including an anti-racism training and orientation. 2 more themes that we found in our student suggestions would be diversifying friend groups. One student suggestion read, if everyone would go outside of their comfort zone and talk to people outside of their social groups, there are many groups that don't overlap and do not want to take time to understand others' viewpoints. And then the last student suggestion we found as a theme was diversifying the student body. One suggestion was that there should be an increase in acceptance and assistance of minority students, and there are more people, and the student body being made up of more people who are not straight, white, and Catholic.
So we also came up with a couple of our own suggestions to make students feel more included on campus. So for one, we can improve transportation systems. Considering our geographic location, it's hard to get around without a car. Or if you're out of state or from somewhere else and you don't have family here to take you around, it can be really hard to go get groceries or just to leave campus. So we suggest ease of access to cultural and physical needs such as mosques, restaurants, ethnic hairdressers, and airports. Another space for improvement is break accommodations. Resources for students who stay over break are very limited. Dining halls are closed, and students who can't go home don't have a place on campus and have very limited diets. These conditions hardly make for a refreshing break. If paying for a full meal plan, many students may not have the money to buy their own groceries, eat out, or have access to facilities and materials to cook if they're not eating in apartments. Not to mention that it can get lonely and boring, making it feel like you're stuck on campus while you're supposed to be enjoying your break and catching up on your rest. Anti-racism training is another suggestion that we have. So this would be required for campus leaders such as orientation leaders, club boards, RAs, Senate members, and administration. One student-led initiative that we saw this year was the World Cafe, which allowed for open dialogue between students on sensitive subjects. So if we could promote and encourage more events like this on an annual basis, then we would be encouraging the open dialogue that is so much needed for students to understand each other.
One final suggestion we had was to alter the labeling system itself. So at other schools, there's only one uniform title, not separated Bennies and Johnnies, like, for example, Tommies and Gophers. We're not sure how feasible this would be because there's a strong network of alums, and I feel like this would be it would experience a lot of resistance. However, one tangible solution that we have might be to include more apparel with both St. Ben's and St. John's on it.
At this time, we're done with our part of the presentation, but we would like to open up the floor to you to ask any questions that you might have for us. Any questions?
Yes. So, I think that you all did a really nice job pulling out those themes of what we consider to be a Benny and a Johnny, and it made sense to me. This is what I've been experiencing too. So I guess my question is, where do you think that messaging is coming from? It's like, where are we getting the messages that this is what a Benny is and this is what a Johnny is? I don't know if that's within the purview of your research.
So I guess one of the obvious factors is probably that when we're introduced to this institution, there are some expectations that we are introduced to, whether whether orientation is your first experience here on campus, or it's a fly-in, or just the website online. I think there are certain visions for what it is to be a Benny or a Johnny, and when you get here, we're told like, oh, you know, like you're supposed to find like your Johnny as a Benny, you know, like that's your thing, like you're gonna go on the chapel walk, you're gonna find your Benny and get married and happily ever after. So like things like that kind of like shape it, and I guess also if you have family members who come here, then you probably have already a set of expectations for what it is to be a Benny or a Johnny. I don't know if anyone else wants to add on to that.
I think that a lot of it as well is just what you see around you when you're on campus, when you're interacting with other people, just when you come to campus, and if you're seeing that a majority of the students are white, or you talk to people and you hear that a lot of people are Catholic or Christian, or when a lot of your friends or the people in your clubs or classes identify as heterosexual. I think things like that, just being immersed in the community and hearing those things all the time and just seeing it around you constantly kind of creates those perceptions of what it means to be a Benny and a Johnny, just because that's what you see around you every day.
First off, congrats to the presentation. I'm so proud of you. I just wanted to ask, having gone through this process and doing this research, has your perception of being Benny's changed at all? And if so, how do you feel like that kind of shapes how you go about school and life here as Benny? You know, let our president know.
I guess personally for me, it has shaped how I feel about being a Benny because being white and being Catholic, I do fit into a lot of those stereotypes, but it is really important to recognize that even if you do fit into like the big stereotypes of what it does mean, it means a lot of other things too, and recognize all the different cultures and races and religions on our campus. I think that's also part of being a Benny, and I really want to embrace that more in myself.
I really liked seeing really positive responses from people about being a Benny, such as strong, empowered, bold, et cetera, et cetera. And so, because I feel like, at least in my friend group, we haven't talked a lot about like what does it mean to be a Benny or what does it mean to be a Johnny. And so this brings a lot of these perspectives to light. And I think it makes me feel reassured that we are making progress and that we are, I don't know, well, there's a lot of room for improvement, but it makes me confident in the fact that like we are recognizing these issues and we're working on kind of mitigating them.
I think that a phrase that stood out to me in this presentation is that, yeah, a lot of people think that we're a community, but are we an inclusive community? And I think that just kind of, it's just something, I think that's a phrase I'm just going to remember from this presentation for a long time and from my research and all of that. So I think it's just gonna, like Louise said, I fit into a lot of the typical, what people responded as like a typical Benny would be white, straight, Catholic. I fit into all of those, but I think we need to practice more radical hospitality, and that's definitely gonna shape how I go forward for my rest of my time at this school and beyond.
Yeah, just thanks a lot for your work. I was pretty surprised that nothing about like Benedict and Johnny usually came up, just because that's something that we talk about so often. So I was wondering if any of that came up in terms of like shaping the character of the Johnny.
So actually, the part of the presentation that did focus on that was the one on religion. So I mentioned that as a Benedictine Catholic institution, we do have a lot of those practices on campus that can leave other people left out, whether you do practice, whether you don't practice religion or you practice an alternative religion to the Benedictine Catholic tradition. So we did discuss a little bit about how people feel excluded out of that because religion is such a fundamental part of people's identities, or it can be. So I guess we didn't really focus so much on that as like a general portion of our studies, but it definitely did come out, and we saw in our responses that people would bring that up, like whether they were agnostic. Like we saw a lot of people mentioning their religious identities and how they didn't feel included because of that. So that was definitely not left out of the presentation. So yeah.
And then also I did a lot of work with the word clouds with other people as well. And so Benedictine did show up. You just couldn't see it in the word clouds because not as many people did include those. But there are also some values that were included. So like respect, community, those were words or identities that did show up. You just couldn't see them in the word cloud.
As a faculty member, I'm really interested in what the impact of your study is for people like me. Now, you mentioned the need for a more diverse faculty, and I think that's really important myself. And the institutions are working on that. But I'm wondering what your recommendations would be for faculty in a classroom situation. And I'm not totally sure how to phrase the question, but for instance, to what extent would you like to see faculty in classroom situations be proactive in trying to bring students together who are different? You know, in my classrooms, Asian students, black students, white students, obviously. To what extent, one example is, to what extent would you like to see faculty members be proactive in trying to break down any barriers? Or do you think that responsibility primarily resides with students themselves and student groups? And do you have any other recommendations for what faculty might do, whether in or out of the classroom?
I would say a big one I noticed is that maybe just education on certain topics, because I know in a few classes I've had, certain topics the professors may not really know anything about, and they kind of misuse certain identities within those topics, and it's kind of hard to stand up and correct them within class because you don't want to undermine them because they are professors. So maybe just like more education on certain topics that students possess within your classes, as well as trying to really get to know them as people, as your students too. I think that's really important with understanding those identities they hold, and that can lead to more education as well, like learning from the students on those different identities they have within your class too. So.
I think another thing too is that, and I don't know how your class is structured, but in general, like switching up who is talking in class, because in my classes I know a lot of the same people talk a lot of the time, and also in small groups, switching up those groups, because I find that students, when we're all in the same groups the whole semester, we get comfortable with each other, and that's a good thing, but also getting comfortable talking to a broad range of people.
Yeah, and to your first point, I think that it definitely falls within the realm of what I'd like to see my professors do more of. For me, it's hard as a student to kind of facilitate these connections outside of my friend group because it's more comfortable to sit next to people that I know, that kind of thing. But kind of if you facilitate that, it definitely gives us an excuse to reach other new people and hear new viewpoints. And I think that's a really important part of our education as a whole.
Okay. So you guys talked a lot about what it means to be like a typical Benny or a typical Johnny. Do you think there's any implications by saying typical, because that assumes there's atypical then? And then what would you guys suggest for fundamentally changing that type of dialogue where you're speaking as typical and atypical, like an angry kind of conversation?
I love the question. We are at this point out of time, so I would really encourage you, if anyone else has more questions, we can answer that one afterwards. But I think we've got one more slide left.
So thank you all for coming. We have a few people we would like to thank as well. So we would like to thank our coordinator, Ellie Larson, our student coordinator, Kalila Mua, and could Corey Gross and Mary Geller please stand up? We would really like to thank you both for everything you've done to help us in our research and get us to where we are. We couldn't have done it without you. And we would also like to thank the whole IWL and just everyone who has supported us. So thank you for being here and for us the whole way along the way.